So what I'm interested in, lots of people are interested in, is how do you create group level behavior change? So we can think about, interventions that try to get individuals to stop smoking, but I'm more interested in sort of collective behavior changes. How do you get a group of people together to stop smoking? So obviously there's a scale difference there, but there's also a difference in terms of these kind of group behaviors being a product of people influencing each other. So it's not just scale, but also there's this inherent sort of group influence question. So there's lots of behaviors that we want to change at the group level. One that people think about is how do you get people shopping in a city, shopping at grocery stores to not use plastic bags, right? And there's lots of interventions to try to get people to not use plastic bags that end up in rivers. You might also want to get students at a school to stop gossiping about each other. So that's another sort of category. Or in workplaces, low-wage retail workplaces, you might want to create the conditions of trust and sort of bonds that allow people to advocate for their rights collectively. So lots and lots of kinds of behaviors that we're interested in at the group level. And there's also obviously lots of kinds of people who are interested in changing these behaviors. These are the interests of government, they're the interests of employers, of nonprofits, and of social scientists. So I'm going to talk about sort of 3 ways of thinking about the relationship between using relationships and changing behavior at the group level. So three different modes. And I should say that there's lots of scholars and lots of people who are interested in all of these 3 modes of thinking about this relationship, but less work is actually experimental that uses interventions directly to think about these. So the first is, how can we leverage relationships among people in a group to figure out who to target in the group for behavior change? So if you want something to take off, who do you go to first? So that's one big category of how we can use social relationships. Another category is thinking about once things are traveling through a group, how do we use the relationships between people to understand how the behavior is actually spreading? Like, what is happening as behavior spreads? And finally, we can leverage interventions themselves to understand how relationships form and change. So this is the vice versa. This is like switching the causal path and trying to understand how you create patterns of relationships between people. Okay, so part 1 is this question of who do you target? So there's lots of kinds of things that we want to spread, that we want to figure out who do we go to first to make this thing happen. And this is a topic of lots of scholarly inquiry, and there's lots of opinions about how to do this and how best to do this. I'm going to show you. So one behavior you might want to spread is that if you have a village, you want people to take up microlending. So who do you go to first to figure out how to get the village overall to start using microloans? Or how do you get people to bring their kids to a health clinic for vaccinations, right? These are sort of foundational questions in the area of development economics in particular. So I actually put this slide together before the people who did this project won the Nobel Prize yesterday. So it was unrelated. So this is work by Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo. So they were trying different ways of identifying who to target in a village. So on the left is they use sort of traditional leadership labels to identify who to target. So people who ran community groups, people who were shopkeepers, etc., sort of pillars of the community, as people have agreed upon, as one way to target people for diffusing different behaviors. On the right is another way, which is where they ask people explicitly, who should we go to get people to take up microloans? So that you're getting direct nominations of influence in the case on the right. So you can see there's sort of, it's a little bit lighter, but there's some overlap between those 2 populations, but not complete overlap. So this is just one sort of category of ways that people have thought about, trying to identify these key players. And I would say there's a couple of basic principles that social scientists have developed for trying to figure out who these people are. So one is that you look for people who are opinion leaders, that other people sort of follow by instinct. Two is looking for people who are gatekeepers, people who control access to resources or information. Three is looking actually at the structure of the network itself, and based on mathematical properties, trying to figure out who is in the best position in the network for something to diffuse. And then four, and what I am going to talk about and what my work with Betsy Palick, who's a social psychologist, has focused on, is actually thinking about who in the group is able to represent sort of the identity of the group, with the idea that they're more able to give people cues about what the norms in the group overall are. So that's sort of, I'll show you what we ended up doing. So we asked, instead of asking kids to nominate who was influential, instead we asked them, who do you spend time with? So this is a behavioral measure of relationships, as opposed to asking who their friends are. But so from this, we can see who's exposed to who else in the school. So this is from one of our studies. And from this information, this type of information, we can build an overall map of what the schools look like in terms of who is spending time with whom else, and who nominates who, right? We can develop a lot of kinds of information about the relationships from this kind of mapping. So if we zoomed out to look at this is one example of one of the schools that we were in. The colors are by grade, so there's massive grade segregation in this friendship network. But we can sort of understand what is the overall patterns of relationship in this group. So in our first study, what we did was try to use these patterns of relationships between people to identify what we called the influential students. And again, we are interested in people who could sort of represent the group to other students overall. So we used two methods of trying to identify these influential students, but generally they were all students who received a lot of these nominations from other students as someone they spent time with, so they were public. And then what we did is we randomly assigned half of those students to a program where they sort of stood up on a stage in an assembly program and talked about anti-bullying, anti-peer harassment kinds of behavior that was sort of appropriate for the school that they were in. And then half of those other students were assigned to the control group. So then what we could do is very explicitly assess what is the effect of having exposure to these these influential students who were in the treatment program on other students' behavior throughout the year. So this is all in a high school. So then we look at students' behaviors at the end of the year, not of the treatment students themselves, but the other students, and we can see that the right-hand column is sort of based on how many network connections you have to other students, to these influential students who were in the treatment condition. And if you have more relationships with those students, then you're less likely to be disciplined for peer conflict. This is administrative data from the schools. And you're less likely to be nominated by teachers as someone who creates a negative environment in the schools. And then you're also more likely to be nominated as someone who defends other students from teachers, nominated by teachers, not defending other students from teachers. So we can see at the individual level that this treatment exposure to these particular kinds of influential students is able to change behavior. But this pilot study was only in one school, so we can't necessarily tell whether this scales to the group level. So our next set of studies was explicitly designed to look at how do we assess how the effect of these kinds of students at the school level. So the second round of study, we had 56 middle schools in New Jersey, and we called the program the Roots program. We did a lot of branding around it. So half of the schools were assigned to this treatment condition. The other half were assigned to the control condition. And in the control condition, we randomly selected a group of students scaled based on the size of the school, and we just interviewed them once during the year to find out what was going on in their school, what sort of experiences they had. And in the treatment schools, what we did was we randomly selected the group of students to participate in this year-long intervention program, which was 10 meetings where we brought these kids who didn't necessarily know each other together and got them to identify issues that they wanted to change about peer harassment in their schools, and then also to identify possible solutions and activities for addressing them. So they did things like this, where they sort of made hashtag posters. They came up with their own hashtags, made posters, signed their names, and then publicized it to the school. And the idea is to associate the kids in that intervention group with an anti-harassment kind of message in a public way. To give you a better sense of what the treatment did, or what this randomization to this treatment program did, here's a graphic of 2 of our treatment schools, and the green shapes are kids who are randomly assigned from the school to participate in the intervention program, and the white are kids who are not, and the circles are kids who are not these influential students, but just any student, and the stars are the kids who were these influential students that they're based on the number of times that they were assessed to be someone that other people spend time with. So what you can see is that here's the influential kids in this particular treatment school. But by virtue of randomly assigning kids to the treatment, what we have is a random variation in what proportion of these student groups were actually these influential kids. So what we could do is test at the school level, what's the effect of having more of these high-profile influential kids on behavior change at the school level. So, so this is data that we got from the schools, from their administration, about all of their disciplinary events and that we coded for whether they were about peer harassment or not. And we could look at what the effect of these treatment groups, and particularly the proportion of those influential students, were on disciplinary events. So what we found, so the x-axis is the proportion of the treatment group that were these influential students, and this is the sort of average number of peer harassment events. So when the proportion of these influential students was larger in these groups, there was fewer peer harassment events in the schools. So this was sort of proof of the influence at the school level, at the group level behavior change, owing to sort of harnessing these influential students in the intervention. A side note, one question is obviously who can identify these students. It's often really prohibitive to collect this kind of network data. So this is another paper where we actually asked the teachers to nominate exactly who they found to be influential in the schools. And as you might expect, the teachers were not very close to what the students actually did. So this is the average student. This is in degree how many nominations each student got. So our measure of influential students was designed to have high in degree students, and teachers sort of landed over here. So in our data, at least, these patterns of relationships are better at trying to figure out who to target for an intervention than is sort of expert or outsider analysis of who to target. Okay, the second sort of question is, once we know how do we use relationships within a group to figure out how behavior actually spreads? What's the pattern by which behavior spreads? So I'm going to show you sort of a proof of concepts that we used for this study about sort of tracing how behavior spreads. So part of our year-long intervention was at the end of the year. We made lots and lots of wristbands with sort of phrases on them that we had these kids in the treatment program give out to other kids. So what we could do was use that as a measure of, at the time of the final survey, which was several weeks after kids were given the wristbands, who was wearing a wristband or who reported wearing a wristband. So this is sort of what they looked like. The kids had come up with these phrases that were relevant to sort of, inclusion messages. And we accidentally created a black market for wristbands in New Jersey middle schools this year. So this is some of the hoarding behavior. But by virtue of understanding the relationships, we can see exactly who is more likely to continue wearing a wristband with the idea that that is sort of promoting the messages of the program as the year went on. So these are, luckily, we didn't give out wristbands in control schools, and it turns out that most kids in control schools did not report wearing a wristband on the final survey, so that was good. And then we can look within treatment schools. If you weren't exposed to, you didn't have a network relationship with anyone in the treatment program, what was your odds of wearing a wristband at the final survey? And it was about 10%, proportion. And then if you were in a treatment school and you had a relationship with a student who was in this group, but the student was not one of these influential students, what is your odds of wearing a wristband? It's a little bit higher. And then finally, if you are in a treatment school and you're friends with an influential student who was in the treatment group, then your odds the portion of students wearing a wristband is even higher. So you can see, sort of using these pattern of relationships, how things spread specifically. So the final piece of this is trying to understand this flip, which is how do we use behaviors to understand how relationships change. So this is, these are maps of the network maps of one school at 2 waves. So the school looks different. That's partly because of the algorithm for drawing the graphs, but also within these schools there's lots and lots of change, both sort of natural change and also created change in kids' relationships across the school year. So one way of assessing how much change there is in relationships is looking at the percentage of your friendship ties at time 1 that still exist at time 2. So we can do this for various schools. And what we found is, independent of the intervention, independent of the treatment, the more stability in your friendship networks, the less depressed kids are, the more feelings of belonging they have, the better their grades. So stability is itself sort of a social good. And then we can ask, in an experimental framework, what effect did this intervention actually have on relationship change? Because you're bringing together part of the intervention, which was not the central goal, but was a feature of the design, was that you're bringing together a group of kids who didn't already know each other and sort of creating a space for them to get to know each other and interact. So the question is, what is the effect of the intervention on those relationships? So what we find is that in treatment schools, for the treatment students, the students who are actually in that intervention group themselves, they experience 12% less relationship continuity than equivalent students in the control school. So it's actually a sort of a net hit to those students who are participating in the program itself. But overall, if you compare all students in treatment schools to students in control schools, there's more stability. So it's not that there's local instability as kids are sort of interacting with new people, but overall we have more stability due to the intervention. So one way that we're trying to sort of extend this work is to talk about what kinds of interventions actually create group relationship change. So some of you may know that there's now sort of a lot of online organizing happening, especially among lots and lots of people, but especially among retail workers. And a lot of these people there's lots of groups that have Facebook groups where they're trying to do building relationships online, right? So this is a fundamental question that people are interested in about how do you actually create these relationships that are mediated through a social media platform. So what I'm working on with Adam Reich is looking at sort of using the platform that the organization United for Respect has built to understand how they're actually trying to create and sustain relationships between people in an experimental way. So what is it about what they do that is able to create group level relationships and create sort of cohesion at the group level? So the argument is that group relationships are a powerful tool for creating and understanding group level behavioral change. The work that I've done in schools, the way we think about these key actors is that these networks that we can build based on who people spend time with is a way of evaluating which relationships, evaluating which people are able to most sort of influence what others think is normative, what others think is acceptable for the group overall. And so that's sort of one way of thinking about a mechanism behind this group level behavior change, is that there's some people who can inform what the norms of the group are overall. And then finally, I think there's a lot of room to do work, experimental work in particular, on understanding what creates the group relationships that create healthy organizations and communities. Thank you.